What's up, AP Psych? Welcome back. We are getting into our second to last video for mental disorders before we move into a couple videos on psychotherapy. It's a big one, the second to last one. We're going to cover 3 different categories: neurodevelopmental, disruptive, and somatic symptom disorders. So again, I encourage you to jump into and dive into those reading guides. Make sure you take some extra time with your vocab because there's going to be a lot of different disorders and a lot of symptoms and a lot of different ways that these present. And we have to be able to make sure that we can write about these things and describe them in detail rather than just common knowledge. Okay, so to start, we're going to hit somatic symptom disorders first. And these somatic symptom disorders, when we talked about the neuron in the brain and we talked about the soma, that's the cell body, right? So I want you to think of somatic symptom disorders as kind of like of the body, an issue of the body characterized by physical symptoms that seem to suggest a physical disorder, but they have no physical cause or evidence. So what this suggests is that their symptoms are linked to psychological factors rather than physical causes. And there's 3 of these that we're going to discuss and go over: conversion disorder, illness anxiety disorder, and factitious disorder. Okay, so again, these have no physical causes, so there's something psychologically going on that seems to be causing them. First up, conversion. Conversion disorder is unexplained symptoms or deficits affecting voluntary motor or sensory function that suggests a medical condition, yet no medical condition exists. So there's some type of physical symptom, but there's no physical cause that they can find. There's no medical condition. So the onset is usually after some type of stressful or traumatic event, right? And that stressful or traumatic event is causing some type of psychological issue. Some common symptoms include paralysis, blindness, deafness, and difficulty walking. And many of these symptoms are anatomically impossible. So for example, a soldier who experiences a stressful event and goes blind, right? He's had no physical trauma to his eyes, but now he's blind and can't see, right? What's the cause of that? It has to be that stress, that trauma that he's mentally experiencing. Another example, there's something called glove anesthesia, where it's the inability to feel or move your hand, but you have sensation in your entire arm, right? And that's anatomically impossible because those nerves are linked. If you can move your arm, you should be able to move your hand and feel your hand. So these issues are popping up, physical issues, yet they have no physical cause. One of the most significant indicators of conversion disorder is something called labile indifference, or the beautiful indifference. And this person has extreme anxiety in other areas of life, right? That psychological anxiety, but there's a lack of concern about what appears to be their incapacitating physical ailment, right? So they've gone blind for an unexplained reason, but they're not worried about that. They're just focused on the anxiety that they were experiencing. And so those symptoms, oftentimes they allow individuals to escape from some type of current frustrating or terrifying or anxiety-provoking event, right? And it leads to a secondary gain. They get attention, affection, or they get to escape from that anxiety-provoking situation. So that soldier who goes blind after being in war, well, if he's blind, he doesn't have to go back into that anxiety-provoking, stressful situation. So maybe that's his reward, and that's why his mind has created this artificial blindness. Okay. So that is conversion disorder. Second up, we have illness anxiety disorder, or what used to be called hypochondriasis or hypochondriacs. And this is the preoccupation with the idea that one has or might get a serious disease, along with misinterpretation of bodily symptoms or functions, right? It's a phobia, almost like, I shouldn't say it is, but it's almost like a phobia of getting sick. So there's 3 major characteristics. There's a physiological arousal. You're worried, you're anxious, you have sleep disturbances. It's getting to you, you're working yourself up. There's a bodily focus. You're closely monitoring your bodily features, your symptoms, you're preoccupied with physical complaints, and your behaviors are designed to avoid or check for physical illness, right? So you avoid people who may be sick, right? You stay out of hospitals, you sleep in different rooms when family members may be sick, and you engage in repeated self-inspection or medical consultation. So we all know those people who hop on WebMD and check their symptoms and they say, oh, I have this terrible thing, right? Think about that, but to the max. Somebody who's actually impacting their day-to-day life, the 4 Ds in a U, it's deviant, it's distressful, it's dysfunctional, it's dangerous, it's unjustified. They've taken it to the extreme, and they're fearful that they're going to end up with some disease, and they're always checking to see what diseases they might be experiencing during that time. They have a headache, oh, it must be a brain tumor. right? And they go get it checked out. Our third, factitious disorder. Factitious meaning fake, made up, false. Okay, so this is a disorder in which a person acts as if he or she has a mental or physical illness. Okay, so conversion, you have a physical symptom without a physical cause. With illness anxiety, you're afraid that you're going to come up with a symptom or come up with some type of disease or a symptom, and you're looking for those symptoms. Factitious, you're making it up and saying that you do have it, when in fact, you have consciously created your symptoms. So you're doing it on purpose, deliberately creating or exaggerating symptoms of an illness in several ways. You might lie about your symptoms or mimic them, hurt yourself to bring about symptoms, or alter your diagnostic tests, like you're taking a urine sample and you contaminate it, or you're having your blood drawn, or you purposely contaminate that in some way. So people with this factitious disorder have an inner need to be seen as ill or injured, right? But not to achieve a concrete benefit such as financial gain. It's to receive some type of emotional benefit, attention, focus, that type of thing. No concrete benefit comes from it. But you're making up this illness because you feel like you need to be the center of attention. A couple different types of this that you may have heard of before. There's Munchausen syndrome, which is where you create physical symptoms for yourself. Similar, so it's a factitious disorder. And there's Munchausen syndrome by proxy, which is where you make someone in your care physically ill. Been a ton of news stories about Munchausen by proxy. Adults, parents making their children ill to gain sympathy for them, to gain sympathy for themselves and their children, to be the center of attention, to be the center of news stories, things like that. So those are all factitious disorders, or fake, made up, false disorders in which you are purposefully faking them. Okay? So those are our three big somatic symptom disorders. Okay? We're going to move on to our second group, neurodevelopmental disorders. This used to be called development disorders. They added the neuro onto it with the DSM-5 to show that biological connection and how brain chemistry is impacting many of these disorders and how they have a biological cause. So this group of disorders that involve distortions in the development of basic psychological functions that are involved in social skills, language, perception, or motor behavior. Okay? And this usually occurs or are diagnosed during infancy, childhood, or adolescence. So these are early onset disorders because that developmental part is key in that. So a few types. We're going to discuss a few specific here, but I just wanted to give you an overall list so that if you see some of these on the AP test, like maybe there'll be some distractors out there, or they're just briefly mentioned, that they're neurodevelopmental disorders. So intellectual disability, we've discussed that in the intelligence section. Autism spectrum disorder, this is one that we will focus on, which now includes what many used to know as Asperger's syndrome. It's been wrapped into the entire spectrum. Communication disorders such as stuttering, attention deficit, hyperactivity, ADHD, many of you know about that. Many of you have personal experience with this. Motor disorders like Tourette's, and then now we have specific learning disability, which used to be separated into dyslexia, dyscalculia, and etc. Okay, so these are all neurodevelopmental disorders. We're going to focus mostly on ASD, autism spectrum, and ADHD. So autism spectrum up first. This typically shows an unusual pattern of social and cognitive development beginning in early childhood, with difficulties specifically in social interaction and communication. It's really hard for them to understand social cues, and their emotional intelligence is underdeveloped. The spectrum now includes from the highest to lowest functioning individuals with characteristics of the disorder. Okay? They've wrapped in Asperger's, and now it is just an entire spectrum under one name. The onset is very early, generally before the age of 3, and usually much earlier. Children are getting checked out at their 15, 16, 17, 18th month checkups, and they're seeing how their motor movements are. They're seeing how their social development is, how their word development, things like that. Because if you can catch autism spectrum disorder earlier, research is showing that there's more success in treatment, and you can help kids overcome some of those deficits that they might have. It's more frequent in males, 4 to 5 times more likely in males than females, and about 70% of young people with autism spectrum disorder also have an intellectual disability. However, it's important to point out this is a spectrum, So 30%, there's still a large group at that higher functioning end of the autism spectrum that don't have those intellectual disabilities, right? It is a spectrum across which there are many different levels. So some characteristics. Again, impairment in social relationships. There's a noticeable lack of awareness or existence of the feelings of others. They may not like to be touched, held, they avoid eye contact, they might prefer to play alone in solitary play. Those social relationships are lacking. There's impaired speech. About half of autistic children do not develop speech. They would be on that lower end of the spectrum. And speech is often like an echo of what is heard for many of them as they develop speech. You can speak to them and they'll repeat a lot of those words. They'll latch onto a phrase and they'll say it over and over again. There is a very narrow range of interests and activities. Many focus on objects almost obsessively. And I know in the intelligence section, we talked about savant syndrome. And many autistic people have savant syndrome, where they have high expertise in one specific area of life. And a big part of autism spectrum disorder is routine. It's very important. If you break a routine, these young people may get distraught, angry. If change occurs, they could lash out, experience serious temper tantrums, because that sameness in that routine is very important to keeping their day in order and keeping them calm. And most engage in some type of self-soothing behavior to block out extrasensory info, because they don't have this filter to block out irrelevant info. They don't really have selective attention, so they have these self-soothing coping mechanisms that they can deal with this extrasensory info when it occurs. So some causes of autism spectrum disorder. Well, there's likely that there's both genetic and environment plays a role here. Researchers have identified a number of genes associated with the disorder, and studies have found irregularities in several regions of the brain and abnormal levels of serotonin or other neurotransmitters in the brain as well. Okay, so moving on to our second one with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's a developmental disability involving short attention span, right? We've all heard about this. Many of you deal with it specifically, but we want to know some of the more intimate details here so that you can really write about it and understand it and talk about it at a high level. So there's distractibility, extreme difficulty in remaining active for any period of time. The disorder is estimated to affect some 5 to 10% of school-age children, and that number seems to be on the rise. There's 3 subtypes: predominantly hyperactive, impulsive, predominantly inattentive, and then the combined impulsive and inattentive version. We'll talk about each 3 of those subtypes. So first, inattention. You're easily distracted, miss details, forget things, frequently switch from one activity to another. You have difficulty focusing on one thing, right? You become bored with a task only after a few minutes, unless you're doing something that you enjoy or you see reason behind. Having difficulty focusing attention on organizing and completing a task or learning something new. Many students with ADHD will turn in half-completed work because they weren't able to focus on it for the entire time. Have trouble completing or turning in homework assignments, like we just mentioned. Often lose things. If you look in a backpack of someone with ADHD inattention, oftentimes it's a mess. They really have to struggle with organization and getting things where they need to be. And they struggle with completing tasks or activities in general. So that's inattention. In addition, those people might not seem to listen when you're speaking to them, right? They're daydreaming constantly. They're easily confused, moving slowly. They're kind of spacing out, as we would say generally. They have difficulty processing information as quickly and accurately as others, and they struggle to follow instructions. So they're going to be a little bit behind because they are constantly having to bring themselves back to the current topic that they should be focusing on, while their mind wants to wander off in another direction. Hyperactivity. These people fidget, squirm in their seats. They talk nonstop, dash around, touching or playing with anything and everything in sight. They have trouble sitting during dinner, school, story time. These people might stand up, walk up to the teacher. I've had this happen. Kids ask me the most random questions in the middle of class because their brain can't stick to what they should be doing, and they want to go off to something new, something more interesting to them, something more enjoyable. They're constantly in motion, and they have a difficulty doing quiet tasks or activities. So that's hyperactivity. Then you have impulsivity, very impatient, blurt out inappropriate comments. They can't wait for their own turn. They show emotions. They have very struggle with emotional control, that emotional stability that we've talked about in personality theory. And they act without regard for their consequences because they don't think through the steps of what may happen. Difficulty waiting for things they want or waiting their turn in games, and oftentimes interrupt others' conversations and activities. They just can't control themselves and their impulses. They have to act those out. It's kind of like when we talked about Freud's theory of personality. You have your id, ego, superego. It's like that id, right? That pleasure-seeking impulsivity aspect, and it's hard to control. Causes of ADHD. Research points to a combination of genetic and environmental factors. Right? On the genetic side, parental genes play a large role. And there's also some recent research that shows the later that people wait to have children, the more likely they are to go through some genetic mutations that point towards or link to ADHD. There's also environmental factors involved. If you go all the way back to when we went over development, we talked about development of the fetus. There are teratogens that can be introduced while the fetus develops, things like alcohol, drugs. Those can cause mutations and lead to things that have been linked to things like ADHD. Right? And those are all environmental factors. Treatment often involves administering a stimulant, something like Adderall, Ritalin, Concerta, which is kind of counterintuitive, right? Why would you give someone who's a stimulant who can't seem to calm down and focus? Well, they improve the symptoms of the disorder, often having a calming effect, ironically. Many of those things do have some adverse side effects, but 70 to 80% of people who find the right medication that works for them can be returned to a, quote, normal or typical behavior when they are treated correctly. So individuals with ADHD may have other disorders as well, those comorbidities such as a learning disability, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, anxiety disorders, depression, or bipolar. One disorder doesn't necessarily cause another, but the symptoms of one may make another more noticeable or more severe, right? So ADHD often comes with some type of comorbidity in these sections as well. All right, so we're moving on to our last section here, which is disruptive impulse control and conduct disorders. So these disruptive disorders, we've mentioned them previously with antisocial personality disorder, and we'll make that connection again. But these conditions involve problems in self-control of emotions and behaviors that often involve a violation of social norms. So there's the difference between that and, say, something like ADHD. They both involve self-control, emotions, and behaviors, but these disruptive or conduct disorders involve violation of social norms, authority figures, and the feelings of others. Okay? So, two that we're going to focus on: oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder. First up, ODD. This behavior typically starts around the age of 8. It may start as early as preschool. And the symptoms must last for at least 6 months and be more than normal childhood misbehavior, right? So these used to be categorized under developmental disorders because you were comparing them to the typical development of children. But now they're under disruptive and conduct disorders. But they have to be more severe than normal childhood misbehavior. Okay? So they actively do not follow an adult's requests, angry and resentful of others, argues with adults, blames others for their own mistakes, has few or no friends or has lost friends, constant trouble at school, they lose their temper, they get in fights, they're spiteful and revengeful, and they're touchy or easily annoyed. Again, to a point where it is obvious and consistent and more than a normally, typically developing child at this point. The pattern of behavior, like we said, must be different from those of other children around the same age and developmental level. Okay? It's thought to be caused by a combination of things: biology, psychology, and social. So here we come back to that biopsychosocial aspect. Your genetics and how that plays a role. Psychological, how they're seeing, they don't want to listen to these authority figures. They don't think they should have to. Social factors, the environment in which they grow up in, the friends that they have, and how they impact their beliefs and how they think about rules, laws, and authority figures, things like that. conduct disorder is our second one. Conduct disorder has been associated with child abuse, family conflicts, genetic defects, poverty, and even parental drug addiction or alcoholism. So those are some of the big links and potential causes of conduct disorder. And this diagnosis is more common among boys. Children with conduct disorder tend to be impulsive, difficult to control, and unconcerned about the feelings of others. Okay. So the big difference between some of these ODDs and conduct disorder is the antisocial aspect of it. We've talked about this before. Antisocial in this instance doesn't mean you don't like to interact with other people. It means you're doing things that are bad for the society, the community around you, and you have disregard for that. You're being an antisocial person in the sense that you have disregard for the rules, the laws, the social norms. Okay. So bullying and fighting, breaking rules without apparent reason, cruel or aggressive behavior towards people and animals, okay? Destruction of property, heavy drinking with adolescents or illicit drug use, lying to get a favor or obligations, running away, truancy, vandalism. In a lot of these instances, different from ODD, there's no remorse here, right? You don't feel bad about these antisocial behaviors. And that's why conduct disorder is a precursor for APD or antisocial personality disorder. In order to, as an adult, be diagnosed with APD, you have to have been diagnosed with conduct disorder in your adolescence, right? And you can develop that personality disorder as you come to adulthood. If your behaviors worsen, then you may be diagnosed with APD. And you may also develop significant drug and legal problems because of your general disregard and your antisocial behaviors for the law and for authority figures and just general societal norms. Okay. So I know I pushed quickly through that because it was a lot and it could take a long time, but I want you to take some time, look at your reading guides, go through your vocab, go back through these notes if you need to, make sure you get down some of these symptoms, you differentiate these disorders so that they make sense for you in your own brain. And we will go over some examples in class to help you do the same thing. Okay. As always, let me know if you have any questions.